who are joining us this morning. Welcome, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to this morning's Converge webinar. My name is Lori Peak, and I'm a professor of sociology, and I also direct the Natural Hazard Center as well as Converge here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome you this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are calling in from, to this webinar, which is going to focus on career pathways and specifically insights from the United Nations Secretariat. And so before we dive fully in, please keep, as you're joining, say hello, let us know where you're joining from in the chat. And I'm going to just cover a couple of housekeeping items here, including that please note that this session is being recorded and we will post this on the Converge website for this particular webinar session. So you'll be able to go back, revisit the recording, or hopefully share it with students, friends, colleagues, and even family members. We hope that throughout the webinar session today, Rhea and Isabella want this to be really interactive and informative. They are leaving ample time for questions and answers. So if something pops into your mind as we're going through this session, please use the chat box or the Q&A box in Zoom. We'll be monitoring both. And again, try to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. Just a few words about Converge for those of you who may be new to learning about this shared use resource. Converge is actually one of several shared use facilities funded by the National Science Foundation here in the United States. And Converge is the one social science led facility in this broader natural hazards engineering research infrastructure, or NERI network, that the National Science Foundation has funded. And we are really dedicated in Converge to advancing the ethical conduct and scientific rigor of convergent hazards and disaster research that is interdisciplinary, problem-focused, solutions-based, and also participatory in its nature, in that it's community-focused and community-grounded. Through Converge, we do a lot of things, including developing shared use resources and free online resources for the broader hazards and disaster community. So a couple of weeks ago, several of you were on another Converge webinar where we were actually rolling out our 13th training module in the Converge series, which I'm so pleased to share. Those training modules have actually been completed by more than 17,000 people from all around the world. They're oftentimes used by educators in classrooms. And so we have a lot of resources to connect to and advance the training modules, including assignment banks for educators. I think Tanya's team in Florida uses some of those. We have annotated bibliographies, resources, and further readings and other materials to accompany the training modules. And we also have more than 50 extreme events research check sheets that are on the Converge website that are just, as the name implies, they're short, usually a couple of page briefing sliders that give key insights to help guide the design, conduct, and sharing of hazards and disaster research. So we hope you'll check out that check sheet series as well as the training modules and other resources on our website, including those related to data sharing and publication. We also brought all of you together today, have a webinar series, and this is the 29th webinar that we've actually hosted over the past several years via Converge. And so again, all these webinars, thanks to Jeffrey Gunderson at the Natural Hazard Center, get posted on YouTube, and then again can be viewed or shared at any date. And so this webinar again will be shared via our website as well. Now, I want to say a few words about what brought us together today, and more accurately, who brought us together today. And so right here, you're seeing a distinguished plenary panel that happened just about a month ago at the 51st Annual Natural Hazards Research and Applications Workshop. And somewhere out here in this audience is Isabella, who you're going to hear from today. But also up here on this plenary stage is the wonderful Rhea, who's going to be our leadoff speaker. And she joined us as a plenary speaker at the Natural Hazards Workshop in June here in Colorado. And she was so fully present throughout that entire meeting. Rhea was out and about from the opening session to past the closing, and she was interacting with folks all throughout the meeting. And it was just really beautiful to see. And one of the requests that Rhea kept hearing was, hey, how do you get a job at the United Nations? How did you get your job there and come to do what you do? And so about partway through the Natural Hazards Workshop, Rhea came up to me and she said, Lori, is there any chance that we could have a webinar soon following on to this meeting so that I could share some of the insights so that Isabella, as one of our star students who's been involved with the United Nations, so we could share some of our perspectives and experiences and answer some questions. And so with that prelude in mind, it is now really, really such a delight to introduce Rhea and Isabella. And I'm just going to share their titles and affiliations because part of the webinar today is actually going to entail them sharing their own stories and their own journeys that brought them to the United Nations. And so Rhea currently serves as a program management officer in the Global Risk Analysis and Reporting section within the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And she's been with the United Nations for about 20 years, which is hard to believe, but she's going to be able to share more about that winding journey that she's had through the big and complex and important organization that is the UN. Isabella, her experience has been more recent with the United Nations. She's currently a Master of Science student in Geography and Environmental Risk and Human Security at the United Nations University, as well as at the University of Bonn. And so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen right now because Rhea has some slides that she's going to share. And while Rhea is bringing up those slides, I hope everybody can join me in the chat with a warm round of thanks for Rhea and Isabella for really listening to what people were asking for. And given this moment where we're in, where the job market is changing so rapidly, just what an opportunity to get to hear from Rhea and Isabella. So warm round of a virtual applause. And Rhea, I'm going to mute my microphone and turn this over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Lori, it was such a pleasure to meet so many of your students and postdocs and other researchers that came to your wonderful workshop. It's the first time I attended it. It was such a great experience. And what I wanted to do today is basically, it seemed to me also when I was still a student, it seemed such a daunting thing to get into the United Nations. So I actually myself had absolutely no contacts within the United Nations. I grew up in a very small town in Germany, daughter of teachers. You know, they were a bit hippie. Most of the people that they knew were either artists or educators, but nobody had any diplomatic ties or was working in government or anything that you would imagine to be the foundation for a career path like that. And back when I was in high school, when I was 15 years old, I started saying, I want to work for the United Nations when I grow up. And teachers were laughing at me and they used to say, you have a very poor English, you have very sharp personality. There's no way under any circumstances can you get into the United Nations. And that really pushed me, because I'm a very stubborn person, to say, I'm going to show you. So when I went to university, I found out that a friend of mine had done an internship at the United Nations Volunteers, which has a headquarters in Bonn, Germany. So it was not too far from me. And I managed to apply and get an internship as well. And then through my connections to the people I worked with, especially my supervisor there, but also some other people that I helped out during my internship, they actually offered me an internship after I finished my master's. Um, they offered me a job as a UN volunteer in Kenya, in Nairobi, Kenya. And it was a very big thing for me, also a little bit daunting because I was like, okay, I've never been to Africa. I don't know what I'm going to do there, how I'm going to manage. And I stayed there for 7 years. So after actually 15 months of working within that office, they offered me a staff position, and this is how I gradually started my career. I've worked there in about 20 countries in Africa, and then in another maybe 20 countries around the world. Now I'm based in Geneva. So I've been working here for 20 years in this organization. But this is not to say that how great I am, because I'm not that great. But believe me, all the people that work in the United Nations are also just people. I know we always seem to be sitting in this ivory tower, and we don't know how to communicate well with sometimes with people. This is what a lot of times is the impression is, and a lot of times it's true. So this is what I'm going to try to convey today a little bit. What's the United Nations? What are pathways? And then hear from Isabella, who was a great intern at our office. How is it actually nowadays to be an intern? Because I was an intern a long time ago, so it wouldn't be the same if I would talk about it. So that's enough about my personal story, but that's just to say that if you want to achieve a career in the United Nations, if you're interested in it, it's absolutely possible. You just have to try. And actually, as at the moment, the multilateral system is a little bit in a changing process. There's a lot of cuts to the UN staff. We lost about half of the United Nations capacity uh, during the last 2 years, and there's going to be further cuts. But it's actually for you newcomers, it's an opportunity as well because we have to change the way we're working. And increasingly during this transition, there's more interns being hired, there's no more consultants being hired, there's more UN volunteers being hired because they're cheaper than full-fledged staff, and it's a great entry point. This is basically how my path went, right? I went from intern to UN volunteer to staff. You can also go from intern to consultant to staff. There's different. You can also be a JPO, a junior professional officer with your government. I'm not focusing so much on that because it's different for every country, but you can find out if you don't know if your country is actually participating in that program because that's also a great place to start to be posted as a junior professional officer. So I'm going to start a little bit with what is the UN actually? So just a short reminder for people who might not remember all of it. Um, this is an international organization that was founded in 1945, so it's pretty old, almost 80 years old. And its main concern was maintaining peace and security. This was post World War II, cooperation, and maintaining friendly relations among nations. And currently we have 193 member states. So it's great that a lot of you are participating from around the world because there's also a quota for UN staff to cover all nationalities. So especially if you come from a member state that's underrepresented, there's national exams as well that you can take. I never looked into that opportunity for myself because as a German, Germany is fairly well represented, so it's not a chance. But if you come from a smaller country that might not have a lot of members of the UN working as staff, that could also be an opportunity because at some point they also try to fill positions with underrepresented nationalities. So the headquarters is in New York, but there's also offices, very big offices at Geneva, Switzerland. This is where we're headquartered. My organization, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is the second biggest, and then Nairobi, where I started, is the third biggest. I'm assuming that that might shift a little bit because right now we're trying to reduce the headquarters in Geneva and New York because of cost reasons, and Nairobi is being beefed up. So staff have been moved to Nairobi as well. So it might shift a little bit, but these are kind of the three main hubs around the world. So the UN is actually the only international organization with a universal membership, and there are a lot of specialized agencies and development funds. So it's extended its scope beyond peace and security, and is also covering climate change, famines, poverty. All these are problems that are very hard for one single country to manage. So the multilateral system becomes particularly important because we see it, and member states see it as a shared responsibility of humankind. This is an international body that is right now very much needed, but at the moment in a bit of a crisis. So there is collective efforts to tackle these modern challenges, and we're still trying to do that as much as we can with limited capacities. The structure, in a nutshell, there's 6 principal organs. Most of them are headquartered in New York. The sixth one, the International Court of Justice, is in The Hague, Netherlands. And the family of the UN is larger than that. You just saw the Secretariat mentioned. It's one of the core organs, and my organization belongs to that Secretariat. But there's also specialized agencies like the IMF, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and separately administered funds and programs. You don't have to remember all of that, but it's good to know that there's many entry points in many organizations, and they sometimes have very different application rosters and all that. So what I'm going to talk about is mainly about the UN Secretariat, but it's just one of those. The others have separate recruiting systems that you may want to check out. And then there's UNDP, the UN Development Program. That's important because they actually manage the UN Volunteer Program. But there's also UNICEF, WFP, etc. So what do we do actually as an office for disaster risk reduction, knowing that a lot of you are involved in things around resilience development, reducing natural hazards risk, etc. So we are trying to mainly protect life and livelihoods. This is my boss. He's the Secretary General Special Representative for Disaster Risk Reduction, Kamal Kishore. Very smart individual. Thank God we have him during this time of crisis. That's such a blessing. He's from India originally. And so what the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction does, it brings governments, partners, and communities together to create a safer and more resilient world. The mandate is this one on the left. So it's the focal point within the UN system, the whole system that you've seen there, for disaster risk reduction, and a custodian of a framework that was supported by most countries in the world. And we're monitoring how it's implemented and review progress with 2 main objectives. One is to reduce disaster losses, and the other one to strengthen resilience for future risk. So now let's get into the career paths into the United Nations. So the first one is a very simple one. It's the United Nations internship program. We have 2 new interns just starting now. In August, there's many new interns starting at the moment, so it's a constant program. Then they will stay for 6 months, and then the next ones will come. So normally it's between 3 to 6 months. Why it's a great way to get in is, especially when it's in person, but we know, of course, locations like Geneva are expensive. It gives the intern the opportunity to operate within the UN system, and many partners. You can create connections that might get you a job, and you really learn the system. So it gives you a big added advantage. And a lot of interns that have performed well have been hired as consultants after the internships. I try to do that always when I have the opportunity, but it's not just me. We do that because we know people, we know how they work. You can also negotiate to combine your internship with a research project for your thesis. And of course, you get your name into publications, which is good. We developed the Global Assessment Report, which is our flagship report. There's there's always the interns that have worked on it have their name there. And if the UN is not for you, you will probably know after 6 months. And then you can just say, okay, too bureaucratic for me. I'm going to go for an NGO, or I'm going to be a professor, or God knows what you want to do with your life. But you might also see that you just don't like it. The general conditions, unfortunately, it is unpaid. It's unpaid and full time. And we have tried to change this. There has been outcries for 20 years. There were campaigns of interns that have lived in tents in Geneva during the summer to show that they couldn't afford, housing. It's just member states are not yet moving on this, and it's outrageous and it's really difficult. So we have tried to make it easier for people who come from, not that wealthy families and maybe far away, by making it also possible remote. So that's the only thing we can do. And you can choose if you want to do 3 or 6 months. Interns work 40 hours per week. Of course, if you sit in a different time zone, I've had interns in Australia or the US, you will not work the same business hours. So we're not requesting you to be up at night, but we should have some working hours that coincide so we can check what everybody's doing. But that's also a possibility. These are kind of the preconditions that have to be met. So they're not required to have any professional work experience. However, it's good to have a field of study that's closely related to the type of internship. Just to give you an idea, just the shortlisted candidates, I usually have about 70 to review, 70, 80, 90 to review per internship. This is the shortlisted ones that are already filtered out by maybe field of study, etc. So it's good that you try to be targeting your internships in terms of your backgrounds. Applicants must be currently a student in the final year of first university degree, so bachelor, a master or PhD program, or have completed a master or bachelor or PhD program within a certain time frame. I think it's within 12 years, but it's indicated exactly when we have the vacancies out. Applicants must have a good knowledge of standard software applications. They must have demonstrated keen interest in the work of the United Nations and have a personal commitment to the ideals of the Charter. There's usually a cover letter where you can express why you're interested in that position, and it's good to also say what actually drew you towards this type of work and why that is close to your heart. It could be something like, I had a personal experience. I read something recently where somebody said, I'm from India. I've experienced floods since I was small. You don't have to have a work experience. It could also be a personal story, something that shows that somehow this has been on your mind. And there's also, it's your kind of your values, and there's a dedication behind it that you want to do something in this field. Applicants must have a demonstrated ability to successfully interact with individuals with different cultures and backgrounds and beliefs. This is very important for us working at the United Nations. We want to have an environment of no tolerance towards racism. There should be we get trained in how to interact with people with different cultural backgrounds. It's very important. So this is why it's written there. Of course, the only way we check that in an interview is you interact with a person and see, are they easy to communicate with? Do they come across friendly? It's like however much you can assess in a half an hour discussion. And then the candidates are required to cover the cost of travel, including visa accommodation. Basically, we cannot cover anything, unfortunately. This is some of the links. So there's a general one on internships at the UN, and the below one is where we have information about internships at UNDR. I'm just going to go very quickly through the other two possibilities, and then I would like to hand over to Isabella to tell us how she actually felt doing an internship at UNDR. So the other opportunity is the UN Volunteers Program. This is what I did. It's a great way in because it's a paid position. It doesn't give you a high salary. It's basically to cover your living costs. So it's about a third of what an entry level person. So when I became a staff, I had suddenly tripled my salary. This is how little I had before. It meant in Nairobi that I couldn't have very safe housing. I had some serious security concerns when I started. You cannot afford much, but it's a great way. And actually, what's funny is that there's this community of people who've been UN volunteers. So you might meet somebody very high up in the system when you start talking to them and say, "Oh, you were also a volunteer." So it gives you a way, and it's a kind of little community within the UN because it's people who believe in volunteerism, and that's why they actually started like that. So it gives you a different edge sometimes. So nowadays they actually have volunteering online as well. This was not possible when I was there. You can volunteer in your country, so you can be a national volunteer and you can be an international volunteer. So all of that is possible. So you don't always have to leave actually your home, and you can support even your own communities if you want to. It's a really great opportunity. This is new conditions of service. Here is a link where you can find questions to almost everything. It's a very good website. So they've just changed their conditions. So before it was starting, I think from 23 or 22 or something like that. When I was a volunteer, it was even up from 25, 26 upwards. I think now what they do is they decide if it's a duty station that's a little bit harsher, they will require you to be a little bit older because they will want you to have a certain life experience and ability to adapt, and you have to have a certain maturity for that. But now you can actually volunteer at 18, and it goes from 18 to 80. So sometimes you find volunteers that are much older, have had very successful careers, but just want to give back. And so the UN Volunteers Program is great because it's not like sometimes junior professional officers, when they come, we assume they're new to a career. With a UNV, it's not always like that. You're more regarded as a professional because you could have between almost no experience and a lot of experience. And there's broad opportunities for host entities and more ways to serve. So this is now this online volunteering positions that you can do from home, etc. There's two ways of getting into a UN volunteer position. It's administered by UNDP. So your point of contact in each country is the UN Development Program, which has an office in almost every country. But you're going to be posted in different agencies, although UNDP also uses UNVs. But basically what that does is that when I started to work at the UNDRR office in Nairobi, I had two host agencies. So I had two support functions, and that was nice, especially when I started. I felt very much, they were really taking care of us, the UNDP office. So they either advertise and there's a competitive recruitment, or you can be in the UNV talent pool. So that's like a online roster, you fill it out. It's a database of candidates, and sometimes they just look for somebody, they put in certain search words and they pull you out. What's important there is to have as many buzzwords as you can put according to what you have done and what you have learned, so that people would find you if they look for specific terms. And then the third pathway is basically to be a consultant. And you can do that through Inspira. This is the entry point for the entire UN Secretariat. It's not just UN but many agencies. Um, so once you roster yourself here, and you have to be rostered to be eligible to be a consultant, we can either find you by just putting in search words, pulling you out. We do that sometimes, or we advertise and then you apply, but you still have to have a profile in the roster. So the link to get into the roster is also here. So you can be a junior consultant, a senior consultant, you can be anything. But there's many consultant rosters that are from specialized agencies, so you would have to search a little bit. However, I haven't put it here, but I'm gonna put it maybe I'll put it in the chat. I'm going to try to put it in the chat when Isabella speaks. There's also the UN Careers portal where you can just search by location if you have a certain country where you would like to go, or you search by agency and then I don't know, I want to work for the Food and Agricultural Organization. Show me all the vacancies that are there in the world currently, and they have consultants too, so they will lead you then to the right roster. So that over time, if you have a specific background, you'll probably be led to the similar roster pages, so it's going to become easier. Usually the first application takes the longest, and then it's just once you're in that specific system, you can usually use the old application to fill a new one. And that's it from me. I just wanted to give you on your way, if you ever think of doing this. My favorite Secretary General is Kofi Annan. He was the one who was my guiding light when I was still studying. And actually, 2 weeks after I started in Nairobi, he had his last and final speech as UN Secretary General in Nairobi. I was sitting in the front row. I remember it as if it was yesterday. He was such an amazing man, and he supported youth and young leaders very much. And there's a quote that he famously said, "You are never too young to lead, and you should never doubt your capacity to triumph where others have not." So you should always keep that in mind when you try. So here's just two snaps from me when I was still in Nairobi. Sometimes I was with government officials in a capital in orderly outfit. Sometimes I was in the field, which is also great fun. But this is what you do in a career like that. It could be one day like this, one day like that. Sometimes you have to monitor what happens in communities with other agencies. But yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. So with that, I would like to hand over to Isabella, and then we can go into Q&A.
Thank you, Rhea, and thank you to Lori as well for including me on this call. I also was at the workshop a few weeks ago, or I guess more than a month ago at this point. And so I wanted to share a little bit, yeah, about how I completed an internship actually within Rhea's office and branch at UNDRR, Risk Knowledge Branch. And I actually like my purpose, I think, right now in being here is really to encourage everyone on this call to apply, or like if they're skeptical, if they think they should apply, I think my main message for today would be like just apply because you never know. And I think, yeah, I guess what I can say is I'm originally from Florida, and I got my bachelor's degree at the University of Florida, so a state school, and I studied international studies. And then I was in Indonesia. I completed the Boren Scholarship, if people are familiar with that one. So I was in Indonesia learning Indonesian with a focus in disaster risk reduction. And I followed the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction on LinkedIn. So I think that would be sort of my like tip number one. Maybe follow some of the agencies that you're interested in on LinkedIn because they tend to post the opportunities there. And I just saw an internship there and was like, why not? Like it took a lot of, I think, courage because I think before that point, I would have never considered myself as eligible or even having a chance at something like that. But I think being at a conference or being at the natural hazards workshop, you surround yourself with people that are really inspiring. And I think what happened to me is I started getting in these spaces with a lot of young people, similar to the natural hazards workshop. And I was like, like those people are doing such cool things. Like, I think I can do it too. Like, I know these people, I like these people, I want to be like them too. So I applied and I ended up yeah, I applied for the Geneva office and I ended up receiving an interview. It was the only interview I got, and luckily it all worked out. And I basically, yeah, I completed my internship. I think maybe before like wrapping this up, I think I would emphasize a couple more things would just be about the internship itself. I had a really great experience. Like, I will say, like, of course, everyone's experience as an intern is different. But I can speak to my own experience, and that was I got to meet so many different people. I got, especially within the Geneva office, everyone in that office seemed to be pushing me actually, like you're here to meet people, you're here to experience and learn. And so that was really great because I think I tend to, yeah, I mean, it's so intimidating. I think I was very intimidated to even talk to people, but it was good that I received permission almost and was encouraged, like, talk to as many people as you can. I did a 6-month full-time internship in person. That was 2 years ago. And I received funding to cover my entire cost of living there through an organization in the US. So I think that is something I want to share. Unfortunately, you have to be a US citizen to be eligible for this scholarship. But I would encourage the scholarship, and I will drop it in the chat, but the scholarship is called UNA USA Fellowship, and it's through the United Nations Association within the US. And so this fellowship covered my entire cost of living because, yes, as it was mentioned, these are unpaid internships. Um, yes, and it even, for example, this is like a very specific thing, but you are required to have your own health insurance while being there. They didn't pay for my health insurance. I will just add this. If people are worried about like living in Switzerland, this is a very specific thing. But you can also like provide a letter from if you have health insurance in the US to say like, oh, I have health insurance here. And that was sort of like a loophole, I guess. Because I think it's for me, like there's a lot of like requirements or a lot of maybe worries about, oh, I wouldn't be able to do this because of X reason. So again, my message is just try. You never know what happens. There's so many fellowships, there's so many I think ways that you can make it work. Yeah, I might stop there.
Thank you, Isabella, for sharing your journey and also for sharing these resources that are really powerful. And I tried to capture them and get them in the chat, but please, if I missed anything. And I wondered if you would, and then we're going to transition. There are a lot of questions, and I'm going to read them out loud because we know sometimes people are listening and may not be able to read. So I'll read, and then Rhea and Isabella can decide who answers. But Isabella, would you say even a little bit more about what you actually did during the internship? And if you had an output, like Rhea was saying, like on a publication or related to your thesis and so forth. Thank you.
Sure. So I worked on an initiative called Early Warnings for All. And maybe Rhea can clarify if this is like a traditional path of an intern, but I felt my work was very specific to this one initiative. So it was basically, I got to read and learn and listen about everything having to do with this Early Warnings for All initiative. And then my main task, I would say, on a monthly basis was sending out a newsletter almost to like internal partners. But it was a really like I think some people may be like, "Ugh, newsletter," but it was a really big deal, I think, because it went out to everyone, like so many different people within the UN system and also donors and all of these people. And I actually remember on maybe first half of my internship, um, yeah, I guess the first newsletter I ever sent out fully on my own, the head boss within the department was reading it, and I like told my direct supervisor, I was like, why is she reading that? Like, why? Which maybe was a silly thing to say, but she was like, no, like this is very like, yeah, we want to make sure this newsletter is right and is appropriate for all the partners. Yeah, so I was focused on this initiative, mostly early warning systems. I got to do a lot of desk-based research, but then also attending like workshops relating to early warnings for all. And also then in the end, I got a little bit more responsibility to like help with putting on a meeting of the partners and stuff like that.
Beautiful. So, and Rhea, I don't know if you want to pick up on that thread about whether this is
Yeah,
typical of an
yeah.
intern to sort of have a project within the UN, or if sometimes interns are spread across multiple projects and then all turn to the formal Q&A and
Yeah,
the chat.
it Thank you, Laurie. It depends a little bit which department of the organization you're in, but typically because we're quite small and we have very small teams, the intern is quite embedded in the team. So my two interns that will now start, one is going to support the global assessment report. She will have her name in the publication. She's going to do some desk research. Of course, we guide that, but she's going to be in all the discussions with partners. So she's a full team member. It's not like you sit in a different room, they also sit with us so we can interact when there's any questions. So this is why it's great if it's in person. The second one will work on, currently we're developing these risk metrics. This is more into data, risk modeling. So I believe there's also a lot of learning opportunities. So it's quite common what Isabella has said, that there's a specific initiative, a specific output. You can also, as I said, if you're still writing your master's thesis or your bachelor's thesis or your PhD, you can also request, you can say, for example, the one of them who's starting now, she said, "Oh, I'm interested in urban risk." And I said, "Okay, the current global assessment report, we don't have such an urban risk focus, but I'll make sure I'll link you up with our urban resilience program that sits in Korea, and we can see if you can actually do something also with them. So it gives you a bit more of an insight how that works. So we always try to, especially because it's unpaid, to really make sure it's valuable for them, and we can coach them kind of on how to position themselves and get them to meet the right people.
Beautiful. So what I'm going to do right now, we have a just over 15 minutes for questions and answers, which is great. And we've had several questions come into both the Q&A box and the chat. And so, and Rhea already answered some of the questions, but just for the benefit of our listeners, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just run through relative,
Yeah.
I'll read the question and then let's answer them. And at any point, Isabella, if you have something to add, if it's a question towards Rhea or vice versa, let's just jump in. And so we're going to start with our very first question in the Q&A from Lydiane, which is, do you need to be aged between 18 and 35 to apply for the UN internship?
No, so you can have any age if you apply, but typically it's career starters. So if you're already 35, I would assume you have some work experience. Maybe unless you come from a completely different field, you should use that to get a paid opportunity. And just one comment on internships. So we see it sometimes, and I've refused a very good candidate because it was her third internship, and I said, girl, you have to get into paid because otherwise people will just see you as the one who works for free. So I would not recommend it. I said we can keep you as an applicant, but my honest opinion is like you should try to get something paid, like UN volunteers or a consultancy, and she did then withdraw.
Okay, thank you. And I actually didn't scroll up to the top of the Q&A box, so I'm going back up. So this is from Dudan, which is, what practical advice do you give to candidates with operational experience in the field who want to transition into the UN Secretariat but are repeatedly screened out despite qualifications?
Well, being screened out, so it's probably just the sheer number of applicants. So don't take it personally and don't stop trying. That's my first advice, because it's just, you can imagine if there's 200 candidates and only 3 are being interviewed, it may seem like that, like, oh wow, I am always being screened out, but it might not be that the case at all, So it might just be that they looked at a very specific thing and some other people had it, and this is why we interviewed them or they interviewed them. But I do believe that if you have some operational experience, you should try to get a UN volunteer position because at least you can make some money, and it's also differently regarded than an internship. It's actually a job. So it's going to be work experience in your CV rather than, I mean, the internship also counts, but it's different. So, for example, in my service in the UN, they do count UN volunteer as part of, I got a long service award for whatever it's worth, but they count the whole 20 years, which is including the UNV.
Thank you. Another question that came in is it says you can negotiate to do research, but it isn't required for interns.
No, it's not. It's just if you're still writing your thesis and it would help your thesis and you want to maybe reduce your hours that you have to work also on your thesis, you could do a specific research and integrate it into your master. So this is just for us to know if there's a specific interest that will help you in your studies.
Nice. And I'm actually going to bounce over to the chat because there was a sort of related question from Aisha, which is I see both or that undergraduate, master's, and PhD students can apply. Does having a higher degree benefit anyway, or is it the same?
No, not really. I mean, I see interns that have several degrees. It's not that I would value them more than others. It's more like, how the letter is written. Sometimes it's like that cover letter is quite important. A lot of people go straight to that. They just want to see that you're able to articulate well in English. If it's something where you need to write something, like the global assessment report, that's less important for our data work. So for the data intern, it wasn't such a criteria, but this is where we can see more how you would present yourself and how you argue and how you make your case. So that's a very important one, less so the degree.
Thank you. Another question here. What are the most effective strategies for mid-career professionals to transition into the UN Secretariat, and which entry pathways are realistically accessible when they're not eligible for like the YPP or the internship
Yeah.
routes?
I think UN Volunteers is a great place because it accepts really people from all sorts of ages and of all sorts of backgrounds that want to start volunteering for the UN, but can be paid. So that's a great one. You should, though, in your CV try to rewrite some of it's like telling the story to another person. So try to make some connections and say this was actually connected to development. This was actually connected to something that is fitting with the UN language, and you can check for example, if you have no idea how to do that, check what, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals that everybody's kind of working towards. What are they saying? So is there something that could link to whatever I have done? Just to make it a little bit more logical that you transitioning from one thing to the other.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm gonna go over here and then I'm gonna go over to the chat for a minute to make sure I'm moving back and forth, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. So I'm gonna go to Gloria Set's question that's in the Q&A box. Is there any difference in the outlook of volunteers who do online service versus in person when it comes to the hiring process and opportunities?
This is for the volunteering or the interns?
It does look like
It's for the
maybe
volunteering.
either, because I know you mentioned that the online's kind of possible in
Yeah,
some cases.
yeah. So if you're an online intern, but your outputs are solid and you actually show up for the calls and things like that, and you show an interest, um, there's no necessarily a difference. I think for your own learning, it would be better if you sit in the office, but we understand that it's not always possible. And now I have two interns. Well, one is actually based in Geneva anyway, but the other one is going to do half-half because she said, I cannot afford Geneva for 6 months. So can I do 3 months remote and 3 months in the office? And we can do that as well.
Thank you. Another question here. Having served as a UN volunteer with UNDP, the United Nations
Mhm.
Development Program in Chad, and for 2 years in community-based climate risk management, what would be the most effective way to position that type of experience for an
Yeah.
opportunity within UNDRR?
Yeah. So we work very closely with UNDP. So often people transition from UNDP to us because we're both kind of working around resilience. So I would say, what is the kind of type of work you've done? And how does it relate to the mandate, the mission of UNDR? This is usually how you can position yourself, but that could also work with UNICEF if it was something education related, or so there's always this kind of where you find common language and then you use that in your motivational letter. Otherwise, I think if you've been already with UNDP and you have a track record and you've worked on something specific to UNDP, it's also quite likely that as a consultant for UNDP or a staff, if they hire, that could also be an opportunity.
And then I'm going to bounce over to the chat because there's sort of a related question about how you position
Yeah.
yourself and form your application. I think this will be good to hear from Rhea from the review side and Isabella in terms of who you had letters of reference from. So Aisha asked if someone has both professional work experience, like in a non-governmental
hmm
organization, but also the academic, the possible for letters from professors, for the reference, who should you choose?
It depends what the job is. So if the
Okay.
job is something that is, for example, related to writing a flagship report, then an academic reference is quite good because we're going to work with academics and researchers to build that publication. If it's something where you're more going to work in the field and it's a regional office that works a lot with NGOs, and that then it would be useful to have the NGO as a reference, but usually you can put two or three references, so you could actually put both.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't remember who I actually had as a recommender. I think, though, it was very specific to the Early Warnings for All project. So I think I did have a letter from a former mentor within the National Weather Service, which I don't know. I think that kind of just matched up really well with what actually the initiative was doing, was working a lot with national meteorological agencies.
Wonderful. And please stay off mute, Isabella, because the next question I think is for you. But it looks like, so Lillian asked, it looks like you can only apply to the UNA USA Fellowship, which again is how Isabella was able to fund her cost of living expenses. But if you can only get that fellowship if you have already accepted a UN internship, are there other options to fund the internship if you get denied from the UNA USA Fellowship?
I think I might not be certain on this, but I don't think. Maybe you do have to have a letter confirming the internship to show them. But like I say, I mean, like worst case scenario, say you don't get the scholarship, I think you can also still like switch to virtual, for example, or have some flexibility there. In terms of other funding opportunities, I don't know. That was the one that came up for me when I searched, but I would say like always, I don't know, I would just keep searching and there's got to be something. Yeah, maybe Rhea, you've heard of another
I
opportunity.
I just know that many universities fund interns to
Mm,
the UN, but as part of their kind of master's program. So when I was an intern, we had some from Spain that were all doing the same master's, but it depends. That really depends on the university, and it's not that I have a list of students who do that. I know that Tsinghua University in China does that. They place volunteers and they actually pay for UNVs to be part of the World Bank or the UN system for half a year or even up to 1 year. And I think there's several of those, but you probably would know that if you're in that such a university because they would probably advertise it.
mm. Thank you. So Esther asked, are there postdoc opportunities or would that be housed under consultant? Where might somebody who's Esther's on the cusp of completing her PhD, and so
Yeah.
where might she
So,
fit
so
in?
you could still do an internship, I think 12 months after finishing a PhD. Is that what a postdoc is? No. Or is it something
You know
after
what?
that?
Yeah, a postdoc is after completing your PhD, like a lot of universities have,
Okay.
where you
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
plugged into a research
Right.
project or.
No, in that case, I think you should anyway, you should be able because we do count doing a PhD already as work experience. So if you have, for example, a UN position where you are required, or a consultancy position where you required to have 5 years of work experience, I think a PhD counts for two. So that would give you work experience if even if you haven't had work experience besides that PhD. So you should definitely apply for a paid position.
Beautiful. I have a question from Gage. So Gage said, as a U.S. Navy vet, would my VA, would Veterans Administration healthcare count as my required health insurance?
I don't know, but normally any type of health insurance, if that's a health insurance, should be counting. But I don't know that you would have to ask the HR department or wherever you apply. They're usually able to answer these questions.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Gage, for your service. A question from Rutian. Thank you both for sharing. I was wondering if the UN Young Professionals Program is still a possible entry into the UN system. If so, does UNDRR, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office, does UNDRR offer positions through the Young Professionals Program?
So we have JPOs that work with us. There's also this young professionals stream where you do a national exam and then you're shortlisted or you're rostered to get a certain position in the UN. The UN Secretariat in general tries to fill these positions. It's not that we have a quota in UNDR of those type of people, but usually there's a push sometimes from New York to get these placed, especially when there were not that many positions that actually turned out, that you did a successful exam and then you weren't placed. So they always try to catch up, especially with the cuts at the moment.
Hmm. So we only have about a minute left, and we have three questions, but I'm going to lump them all into one bucket because they're all wonderful and they're very similar about sort of if you're wanting to get into the UN, what qualifications, experiences are most valued? Is it military emergency management? Is it having a PhD in climate risk and health? What is most valued? And I'd like Rhea and Isabella, for you both to answer this from your vantage point. So, Isabella, as an intern, what do you think were the skills, characteristics that really made, of course, you successful, but other interns? So, if you were saying to somebody applying, what would you spotlight? And then, Rhea, of course, as somebody with the experience you have, the application review you do, what would you recommend people spotlight based on their experience or what you most value?
I can
Isabella.
answer. Yeah, sure. I would say my advice would be just to like tailor whatever experience you have to what's written on the description or what are the requirements or what are they asking for. Because I'm sure many people on this call have many different experiences that they can sort of just make sure it aligns very closely to what's being asked of the job description or the internship description.
Yeah, and I would answer actually all of the above because it really just depends on which organization and which part of the UN. It's so vast. We have from lawyers, doctors, the WHO. There's organizations that are highly science focused, like the World Meteorological Organization, UN Environment Program, where you almost need a PhD to get a certain position. In UNDR, that's not the case. You don't need to have a PhD. But in others you do. And then there's organizations like UN OCHA that work in crisis response, where military background is great, mine action, etc. There's lots of so many different parts of the house that we really do need experts from across the board. So whatever your kind of professional background is, I think there would be a spot for you. The question is just to find the right, as Isabella said, the right position, and then apply for the right career.
Rhea and Isabella, thank you so much. This was such a lively, interactive, informative session, and just the proof is in the number and the depth of questions that you received. And thank you so much for giving this time to us. I really wanted to thank everyone who joined this call this morning. You obviously just have such, as Isabella said, we want to acknowledge and recognize all of you out there in the vast knowledge, experience, networks that you all are bringing to this enterprise. And right now, the world needs you. The world needs what you're doing. The United Nations and so many other organizations need this kind of skills, expertise, and educational experience that you all have. And so thank you, Rhea and Isabella, for doing this, for sharing your knowledge. And thanks to all of you for coming today. We will post this on the website and hope it can be useful. And we hope that you will sign up for updates through the Converge webinar series. I really want to thank Rhea again and Isabella for suggesting this, because I think we're on to something and may start a career pathways set of mini sessions through the Converge webinar series, because I think people are really hungry for this knowledge across a range of institutions. So thank you for inspiring us and enlightening us.
Thank you, Lori, and thanks, Isabella, for coming on. And yes, I would just encourage everybody, because as you said, it's very much needed in this time of kind of transition in the world. And we want to encourage everybody, because it's not, we would miss a lot of great colleagues, I think, if we wouldn't get the word out a bit more. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. And as always, please remember to take care of yourselves as you care for others. And until next time, take care. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.